Hello, everybody. I'm Rupa Subramanya, and welcome to the Rupa Subramanya Show. Today, we have a great guest. Aaron Wudrick is director of the Domestic Policy Program at the Ottawa-based think tank, the MacDonald Laurier Institute. He's been at the forefront of some great commentary on some very big domestic issues like immigration reform, healthcare, the opioid crisis, and more recently, allegations of foreign election interference in our elections. All of these issues have been in the news lately. We're going to talk about them, and it's a real pleasure to welcome Aaron to the show. Aaron, welcome to the show. I wonder if we could just start by chatting about something you wrote recently in the Montreal Gazette on immigration reform. You start with the crisis at Roxham Road. I've written about this as well recently. You have this crazy loophole in our third safe country agreement with the US where would-be asylum seekers, if they cross illegally or what Canada euphemistically calls an irregular border crossing, they have to have their case heard and not be sent back to the US. Now, the Americans are too shy about enforcing their borders, yet the Trudeau government has been extremely lax. Why do you think this is? Is it driven by politics, incompetence, or is something else going on here?
Yeah, look, it's a bit of a pickle from a legal standpoint because of this deal we have with the Americans. It basically is a loophole, like you say. And it's a loophole that's being abused dramatically right now, right? I mean, for many years, no one cared about this loophole because there was nobody coming. But the numbers of people who are coming, and to be clear, it's nothing like on the US southern border or what they see in Europe with millions, but relative to what Canada had got before, we're talking about tenfold increases in the number of people.
Mhm.
And I think this really starts to eat away at Canadians' confidence. I think a fundamental thing for a lot of people is having integrity on our borders. I mean, countries have to have borders. If you don't have a border in a country, you're kind of not really a country. And yes, of course, every country is going to be able to decide, how many refugees can we absorb? How much humanitarian support are we willing to offer? That's up to, people in any given country. But you can't have people sort of abusing the system and sneaking in and using loopholes. That undermines, I think, trust in our borders and our system generally. And frankly, it's not even fair to other refugees who are going through the right process and following all the rules. I mean, they're essentially getting crowded out by these people who are breaking the rules.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, a couple of follow-up questions to that. So, Roxham Road is not a legal border crossing, yet it was closed during the pandemic, and then Trudeau decides to reopen it. I believe in the fall of 2021. Why would you reopen a border crossing that is not legal?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. I mean, why have legal ones if you're going to sort of openly send this invitation? And let's not forget the
Yeah.
prime minister had it previously sort of signaled that Canada is welcoming and almost sort of inviting people in not so many words
Yeah.
to abuse these loopholes. So he says, well, we've got a 5,000-mile border and we can't block all the spots. Well, as you point out, it was closed during the pandemic, so it can be done. And secondly, yes, maybe you can't close. You can't. It's not like you can stand a cop, every 10 feet across a 5,000-mile border, but you can certainly make it harder. You can certainly make it less accessible for people. And, they say, well, that's dangerous, but it might also deter people. I mean, people are doing this. They're using Roxham Road because it's easy to get to. And if you make it less easy for them to abuse loopholes, and it follows that fewer people are going to abuse them.
Yeah. You also make a very interesting observation in your piece in this op-ed that unlike most Western liberal democracies, Canada has a near universal all-party consensus, at least among the major political parties, in support of large increases in immigration targets. But you note that in some ways this is a facade. People are afraid to challenge the official position because no one wants to be branded a racist or a xenophobe, and the consensus could crumble very quickly if things go south. Do you want to elaborate on this argument? What's the actual level of support for high immigration targets in Canada, and how are the major political parties positioning themselves on this issue?
Yeah. So first, I want to be clear. I mean, I'm a child of an immigrant. My wife is children of immigrants. I'm pro immigration. I think immigration has been good for Canada, and I think we are lucky that we live in a country where we have people who come here because they want to be Canadian. So that's a good thing. I also think that generally speaking, Canadians are welcoming to immigrants. What I'm talking about, in the piece I wrote, is that this idea that people can't have reasonable concerns, most obviously about the number of immigrants that are coming, and the reason for that even has nothing to do with even the types of immigrants. It has to do with things like housing. It has to do with things like infrastructure. It has to do with things like the fact that people can't find doctors. I mean, what is the point in welcoming people to a country where you have nowhere for them to live and where they instantly become competitors and exacerbate a demand problem for housing that's already a huge problem for the Canadians who are already here? So I think we need to be reasonable. We need to listen to the concerns about people who are saying, hold on, can we take this many people? What is the impact going to be on the rest of the country? Can we manage this level of immigration? We have to take that seriously, because if we don't do that, I think we're going to get a much nastier backlash. And I don't think anyone is going to like the outcome.
Okay, so since you mentioned a number, you said number in your response. What is the magic number? I know a lot of people have been a little taken aback by the fact that Canada is now going to have 500,000 people coming in every year starting next year, I think. What is the magic number? I mean, I get all of the arguments. I've made these arguments myself that can the system actually support this large influx of immigrants coming in? I'm also an immigrant myself, but I do have concerns, just like the ones that you raised. Can the system actually support this large number of immigrants coming in? How do you decide the number? Why 500,000?
Yeah. Well, maybe part of the problem is that we're picking a number, right? I mean, we don't do this for a lot of other things. The government is trying to centrally plan a metric, which is really should be more market driven, right? I mean, part of the decisions that we make, and our system is already structured this way, frankly, to a better degree than other countries, where the point system, the immigrants that we select outside the humanitarian and the family categories are based on our economic needs, right? The government tries to estimate. So, but we should go a step further. In a lot of cases, I think, and the model I mentioned in my piece is for refugees. I mean, the evidence shows that privately sponsored refugees that have people who support them and help them integrate and help them learn the language and find jobs, they have much greater success. It's a win-win for Canada and for the refugees than the ones that have government sponsorship. I think when it comes to economic categories, we need to look at this more. It needs to be employer driven. It needs to be driven by places and industries where they have labor shortages and they can't find people. That's a better fit than picking a number and saying, well, we're just going to let in 300,000 or 500,000 or 800,000. It should be a market driven process. That, I think, is the better way to ensure both they have the support and that there is a defensible rationale for letting those people, that level of people in.
Yeah. I was also struck by this analogy that you make in your piece. It's analogy between your argument on immigration and a very similar situation with socialized medicine, for example. So for decades, again, there was this all-party consensus on socialized medicine, and many Canadians apparently identified this as a key feature of Canada or the Canadian identity. Anyone challenging it was seen as, as was branded as cruel and heartless, and no party really touched it. But now you have these provincial healthcare systems that are basically collapsing all over Canada. They're falling apart, and provincial governments are now finally testing the waters by privatizing more services. How do you see this debate on socialized medicine and allowing a private alternative play out over the coming months? Could this be an election issue? I should note that one of the things that struck me about the immigration issue is that there are a lot of liberal voices in the pages of the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star, I think, that have been raising concerns about, can we actually support this large influx of immigrants?
Yeah, look, first on the healthcare debate, I think the taboo's gone. I think it's gone. I think that's a good thing. I think we can actually have a grown-up discussion about healthcare. I mean, it's kind of bizarre, the language around healthcare. It only really is here, right? I mean, you don't have this taboo against private healthcare in any other country, including progressive and lefty parties and politicians in other progressive countries. They just don't have this strange taboo around a public private healthcare. So when it comes to immigration, what my hope is that we can have a little bit more nuance, that we can recognize that people can have legitimate concerns about immigration that isn't because you're racist. And I don't want to say there aren't any racists. I mean, there are some people that just don't want immigrants because they don't want people who don't look like them to come here. I'm not talking about those people. I don't agree with those people. I agree with the people who say, I would be fine with welcoming new people, but I can't find a family doctor. My kids can't afford a home. Until you address these things, I'm voicing the fact that I'm concerned that we don't have the ability to absorb, hundreds of thousands of new people because there's just no room and nowhere to put them.
Yeah, I mean, again, I asked the question, why? Why this increase in immigrants? Is there a labor shortage in the country? Of course, we know that there is labor constraint in Canada, exacerbated by the pandemic. What exactly is going on? I'm a little puzzled.
Yeah, well, look, part of it is demographic shifts, and essentially every sort of developed country is going to be dealing with this problem. You've probably seen people have seen in the news, the fertility rate has dropped sort of across the developed world. Historically, the immigration has sort of made up for that gap. And now the debate is like, well, what's the right level? And there's another separate debate about this, because some people say, well, why do we need new immigrants, or why do we need to have more babies? Well, all our social safety nets are built on this sort of pyramid, right? Where there are more people working than are retired. That ratio is shrinking dramatically. So it's going to put a lot of pressure on our healthcare system, pressure to increase taxes, things like CPP. So we do need to do something. We need to get the right mix between, immigration and having, families in Canada having the amount of kids they want to have. It's not about telling people they have to have kids, but surely, and there was other work out there showing that there are a lot of Canadians who there's a gap between how many kids they have and how many they want to have. Surely that seems like a legitimate public policy problem for governments to be wrestling with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Shifting gears a bit, in your role as Director of Domestic Policy at MacDonald Laurier Institute, I believe you commissioned a study last fall assessing the response to the opioid crisis in BC versus Alberta. This issue has been heating up with, you have the usual progressive commentators decrying Alberta's approach and praising BC's. What is the real story here? What exactly is the difference in approaches between the two provinces? Are they really that different? And what, in your opinion, is the way out of this opioid crisis?
Yeah, look, this is obviously a very charged topic, and I think it's hard to separate the politics from some of the facts here, right? It's very highly charged, and politicians have a very strong interest to sort of make anyone proposing some alternative as the villain. So I think both on the sort of liberal and conservative sides, you've seen both some exaggerations and some sort of misrepresentation of what these two differences are. What we have in British Columbia and most of sort of the West Coast United States is what they call the sort of the harm reduction safe supply approach. The logic behind this is people are going to do these drugs anyway, so we're going to give them clean versions of the drug, which is to say, there's still drugs that are bad for you, but they don't have sort of street ingredients in them. So, the odds of an overdose are lower. You have these safe injection sites, so people have help on site so they don't die. The thing that has done, of course, is that they don't die at these injection sites because there's staff around. So that's the sort of thing that the safe supply advocates are sort of declaring victory on, saying, well, people come to these sites, they do drugs, they don't die. That's a win because you can't help people recover if they don't die. And that's their argument. I think if that's where you stop the analysis, that's pretty hard to argue with. The problem is there's a lot more going on here. I think a lot of people believe that it's, yes, keeping people alive is important, but it's not the only thing. What happens after that? How do you help them recover? How do you incentivize them to recover? What are the impacts of things like, if you look at places like the Lower East Side in Vancouver, the tent cities and homelessness is growing. It is not shrinking. Crime is rising. It is not shrinking. So there are other problems associated with this. Like, yes, it's great that more people aren't dying. That's a victory. I'm not saying that's bad, but you can't just stop there and say, we won. This is the solution. And in Alberta, what they're doing is a little bit different. They do have an element of harm reduction. They don't give you the street drugs. They give you sort of synthetic drugs that address the high, that address the craving, but don't give you the high. But they have all kinds of levels of off ramps into treatment, which is all fully funded. So, in Alberta, it's not just about keeping you alive. It's about what can we do to try and get your life back on track as well. That's the real distinction between these two approaches. I think some people are trying to frame Alberta as some sort of retro 1980s, throw everybody in jail who smokes one joint kind of thing. That's not what Alberta's doing. Alberta's trying, I think, to take the best of the harm reduction approach, which is keep people alive, but also recognize that for society's benefit and for these individuals, you can't stop there. You have to try and look at everything you can do to help them recover, to get them off drugs, and to incentivize recovery, which is something that we don't see in places like British Columbia.
Yeah. So, on a related issue, BC took the extraordinary step recently of legalizing the possession of a small quantity of illegal hard drugs. I believe hard drugs such as cocaine, heroin, etc. Yet the production, sale, and purchase of these drugs is still illegal. So can you tell me how exactly this is supposed to work? How does it make sense to legalize possession when you can't legally buy it?
Yeah, I think this is just another step in the whole destigmatization argument, right? It's that we can't, and it's also a matter of, well, we don't want to criminalize someone who's got an addiction if they can't help themselves, and all they're doing is feeding their own habit, as opposed to increasing the supply and getting other people addicted. That's a relatively minor crime. My response to that is this really going to change very much? I mean, in a lot of cases, when these laws were on the book, they weren't enforced anyway. So I really don't know that there's going to be a really dramatic shift here. And when it coming back to the stigma issue, I mean, I think there's a legitimate debate about, sometimes stigma is it can be a useful incentive to people, right? And I find that there's a big disconnect in sort of progressive circles between stigmatizing things like cigarettes and alcohol versus cannabis and hard drugs. I mean, why in some ways is it acceptable to try and stigmatize it and see that as an effective way to get people to change their behavior? In other cases, it's like, well, we can't do that because it won't help. I find there's an inconsistency there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Switching gears yet again, Aaron. Let's talk about the public inquiry into the Emergencies Act. It's disappointed many, including myself. I've written about this as well, and despite all of the caveats in what Rouleau said, ultimately he was rubber stamping what the Trudeau government did. Again, you had an interesting take criticizing the report. You're also a lawyer by profession. Could you dissect where you think Rouleau went wrong, and whether he ought to have found whether the government acted incorrectly in using emergency powers? You note in your piece that the Rouleau report is not the last word, and ultimately this will be decided in the court of public opinion, presumably at the ballot box in the next election. Do you think this will, whenever that's expected to happen, do you think this issue will resonate enough with especially fence sitters that could sway how they vote in the next election?
Yeah, I mean, on the first point on the electoral consequences, I actually think the people, in the minority on this issue, so, supporters of the convoy, I think it's going to resonate more with them because it is going to be fresher in their mind. I mean, a lot of the people who came to the protest, I mean, they did it out of exasperation. They did it out of frustration. They did it because the measures being imposed on them were causing real hardship in their lives. And so for them, that is going to weigh heavily on their mind. I would guess that probably most of those people were not voting Liberal anyway, so I don't know about the electoral consequences. In terms of the report itself, first of all, I do want to say there were some good parts of the report. I thought that Rouleau did a much better job than certainly other observers, recognizing, for example, that not everybody in the convoy was a racist, and there was not, I think he did a fair job of saying, what, the media and some politicians, they really didn't help this by trying to characterize this as some, uniformly hate-filled get together. I think he did a better job with the nuance there. So I'll give him credit for that. What really bothered me, though, was that while recognizing it wasn't his job to make a legal determination, he kind of went ahead and did it anyway. And then he did it with all these sort of caveats saying, well, I'm not entirely sure, and I recognize people could disagree, and I recognize the court is going to have the final say on this. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and say I think it was valid under the law. To me, as a lawyer, you either sort of state your opinion because you're supposed to and stand behind it, or don't say anything at all. He could have actually just demurred and said, you know what, it's not my job to make a ruling of legality. That's for the court. And he didn't do that. The other thing, a theme that sort of ran throughout it that bothered me was that he seemed to almost be leaning all the time to looking for ways to make it easier to use the act. People need to recognize this law is so unusual and extreme. It's basically supposed to be, it's designed to be very hard to use. Like government should have to jump through so many hoops to use this thing that they almost never even want to think about using it. And all the recommendations that Rouleau makes are almost about how can we make it easier in the future for a government to use this in any context. I think that's very problematic. I think it's against the spirit of the act. And I think it's the opposite. I think the government, if anything, there were some wiggle rooms over certain interpretations. People are probably familiar now with this definition of threat to national security under the CSIS Act. I mean, these are things that were put in place to make it hard to use, and Rouleau is basically viewing them as obstacles. And I'm like, yes, they are obstacles. They were there for a good reason, and we should keep them there. We should tighten them up. We shouldn't be saying, oh, well, we've got to make it easier for governments to use this tool down the road. And I fear now, because of that report, there are going to be people who are saying, oh yeah, let's make this easier to use. And one last thing on that, I really feel a lot of people make the tremendous mistake of their position on the act and its use falling along the line of whether they like the convoy or not. I think that is a tremendous mistake. People need to think of it in a context where they don't know the nature of the protest and they don't know whether they're sympathetic to it or not. That is the proper test, because someday, I genuinely worry about this, there's going to be a different government and a different protest, and all the people that were happy to use this hammer on the convoy are going to be horrified when a future government uses this act and they're going to use all the same arguments that the Trudeau government used against the convoy. The only difference is that people are going to be sympathetic to the cause where they weren't sympathetic to convoy. And I'm a firm believer that governments should not use tools, against their enemies that they then could have used against them down the future. Don't use a tool if you're not prepared to see a different government with a very different point of view. Use the same tool later on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's got to be some consistency, and this cuts through partisan politics, and of course, I mean, what happened sets an incredibly bad precedent for that, and as you point to this, that future governments could use this for an issue that their supporters care about, and it's very dangerous, and yeah, and I must say I'm just more than just disappointed. I'm actually quite worried, but anyway, talking about being worried. Let's talk about what's in the news right now, which is China's interference in Canada's elections. Until now, I feel that Trudeau has been Teflon man. Many people have referred to him in that way. But finally, it appears that this very serious issue of China's interference in our elections, this might finally spell the end for the Trudeau government. So far, the NDP, which at first joined hands with the Conservatives in agreeing that there should be a public inquiry, seems to have gone radio silent after Trudeau quashed the idea. Do you think this special rapporteur is meant to give the NDP a face-saving way to keep supporting the government? How do you think things will play out?
Yeah, look, with respect to the NDP first, I mean, I understand their rationale for striking this deal as a sort of, well, we could be a positive influence and we can deliver a tangible result. I don't know that they properly weighed the trade-off to that. I think if to the average Canadian, it just looked very bizarre to be both sort of a member, almost a coalition partner, and also a critic. Like every time Jagmeet Singh opens his mouth to say, well, I'm going to hold the government accountable for this, people were like, well, you have the power to do that right now. I mean, you can hold them very accountable, and he never does. So it just seems a very strange, the obvious question that I think a lot of people will ask. As to whether, the prime minister is going to use another one of his political lives up on this. I mean, if he's got 9, he's probably running out of them now. Part of that is his specific government's track record, but part of it is also just how long he's been there. I mean, people forget it's coming up on 8 years that Justin Trudeau has been prime minister. Every government starts to pile up baggage. This is not specific to him. And, I mean, if people remember the euphoria of 2015, he was this fresh, new progressive face. I mean, that feels like a lifetime ago for a lot of people, including for a lot of his voter coalition. So, I do think, and the other thing too, I don't think he's Teflon man. I think he's consistently lost support over these issues. I think blackface was a hit. I think SNC-Lavalin was a hit. I think all the ethics violations were a hit. I mean, I think these are hits. People forget he lost the popular vote the last two elections. Yes, the quirks of our electoral system means he stays in power. Those are the rules of the game. But in terms of the number of Canadians that voted for him, he was outvoted by his opponents the last two elections. So he's not exactly starting from a position of strength here, right? So I imagine they're going to carry on as long as they can. I think the government is at the point now where they recognize they're probably not the favorites in the next election. So they're going to try and forestall that day as long as they can and hope that something comes up that might change the game, a misstep by Mr. Poilievre or some other sort of economic good news or something that they can change the channel with. Because right now, this Chinese interference story, it's interesting. I think had Mr. Trudeau not sort of spent a lot of his political capital already, people might be willing to give him the benefit of the doubt now. But with things like SNC-Lavalin and all these other instances where he sort of, if not lied, certainly omitted things that he should have said, people now, when he says things like, well, I didn't know, or, well, I'm going to appoint an eminent, impartial person, a lot of people are not willing to give him the benefit of the doubt of it. And he only has himself to blame for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, since you mentioned the elections, last question for you. If the election were called today, there's a good chance, according to various polls, that Pierre Poilievre would be the next Prime Minister of Canada. If the Liberal government survives its full term, then we won't see an election till 2025. How do you see this battle playing out between now and then?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting question for Mr. Poilievre is that, he was obviously elected with some very enthusiastic supporters. I mean, he clobbered his opponents in that leadership race. It wasn't even close. I guess the question for him is, when the fire is burning that hot, how do you keep it burning at just the right temperature, right? A lot of his people already in his coalition really don't like Justin Trudeau. I mean, we already know that. The question is those folks that are on the fence, maybe they don't love Trudeau, but they kind of need an alternative that's a little more inviting. How do we get those people? That's the tougher hill to climb, those last 5% for Mr. Poilievre. And it's going to be interesting to see how he balances keeping his supporters who are very angry, happy, and convinced that he's in their corner, while also reaching out to people who maybe aren't really angry, but are kind of annoyed with the current government and could be sold on, voting conservative. How does he walk that line? That's going to be an interesting challenge for him in the coming years.
Okay, well, on that note, Aaron, I really appreciate you sharing your insights with us and for being on the show. And I look forward to having you back again sometime soon.
It was great. Thanks for having me.